I'm talking with composer Chris Hajian, who last year composed two fantastic documentaries, Unraveled and First Position. Chris also has done a number of sequels for Disney, family-friendly franchises like Inspector Gadget and Beverly Hills Chihuahua. But to start off, how did you get involved with music, and what led you to be a film composer?
Cool. Well, I started out playing trumpet. My dad was a professional trumpet player, so I had the love of music early. Mm-hmm. And basically, he exposed me to the jazz classics and the classical world. So I always adored both of those genres of music. And I was pursuing trumpet playing. I got accepted to the High School of Performing Arts. I was there when they made the movie Fame.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was an amazing experience, by the way. That school was this phenomenal training. But so anyway, when I was playing trumpet, I was always very drawn to composition. I never studied it formally up to that point. Mm-hmm. After high school, I got accepted to Manhattan School of Music, which is a conservatory here in New York City, as a trumpet major. And that's when I sort of just said, you know what, I love the trumpet. It's a great instrument, but I didn't see it as my life's journey.
Right.
And it's funny you ask, because I was telling the story the other day to somebody. I remember playing in orchestras, and I'd be playing Mahler Symphony or something, or Ravel, and I would instead of focusing on my part, I'd be like, wow, that oboe part is so cool. And a couple of times I would miss my entrance,
Yeah.
So I found that my ear was going to other places. So anyway, I made the leap of faith, and even though I'd been writing things of my own and in classical and jazz, I said, I'm going to try out for the composition department at Manhattan School of Music, and after my freshman year. And I made it. I got into the school. So, it kind of showed me that I had some ability, certainly, to compose, at that level. As far as getting involved with film, so once I kind of started pursuing that training, I was always just very tapped into the magic of what music does to picture, Mm-hmm. And whether I was listening to a Bernard Herrmann score or something classic or Korngold or Williams, I just loved the genre. I looked at it as a classic American genre, even though of course there are Europeans that are in that world.
Right.
But I thought the music was staggering, and I was a kind of obsessive as a kid. I would play a scene from a movie and then put different music against it, just to show how that emotion radically can shift someone's perception.
Yeah.
So anyway, after college, and I'm sorry if I'm being a little long-winded, I will wrap this up.
Not at all.
After I got my classical degree, I had the kind of chops, and I understood the orchestra and I understood form and structure. I got out and doing some small jobs in music. I got really very involved in commercials and commercial work soon after school. Just so invested in all the synths and all that stuff, which was kind of just kind of starting out at that point. I graduated in '87, and that study, and it sounds kind of crazy because even though you're dealing with 30 seconds or 60 seconds if you're lucky, man, you really develop skills as far as picture to music. And even though you're selling a product and stuff like that, it doesn't have the narrative that a film or a documentary has. I really started to develop the understanding of marrying, composition to picture and cuts and edits and pacing. So
right.
that sort of made my leap. And then right after, I did that for a couple of years, got some great experience, and then I just said, I have to do something longer than 60 seconds. I thought I had skills that warranted that, and I just kind of made the leap, and I really kind of said goodbye to the advertising world, and I kind of, did a couple small indies and worked my way up, and just started to learn my craft,
That's a cool journey. I like that one.
yeah, we all get there how we get there,
Yeah,
but for me, I was just happy that I think it was important for me that I kind of just, I didn't want to do commercials and then do narrative films. I just didn't. I don't want to say I didn't want to be corrupted, but I didn't want to bring that. There's a similar skill set, but you also have to forget all about that. I mean, there's not much other relationship between doing a small commercial and doing a, creating an arc of a story in a film score. So I just didn't want to like have that on my plate. I mean, financially it was crazy because I was making good money in commercials, and all of a sudden I'm doing these indie films for no money. But it all worked out.
Well, that's good.
It all worked out.
But so when you're writing for, say, a picture, what's the most inspiring aspect of the story when you write it? Is it the characters, the plot, the setting? What do you focus on first, and how do you incorporate the rest?
Well, whatever the narrative is, I mean, it differs a little bit between a scripted feature or a documentary.
Right, of course.
I tell you what, certainly what inspires me, obviously any kind of emotional connection, whether it's to a character or the plight of a character, or and then the other thing that is something that composers really, really play off of is the cinematography.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure most composers would agree, but I don't hear people talking about it as much. The look, the physical look of a film, I think, it's that kind of, they put that visual stamp, and a composer, when he scores this film well, tonally is putting that, that auditory stamp. And, there is a real connection between somebody filming something. I mean, just kind of look like film noir has a look, right? And that motivated a certain sound, with that. Or, the way like Darren Aronofsky would shoot a film, it's more phonetic. And so there is a real correlation. So, like in the case of either of these documentaries, both these stories were so captivating, one being about a corrupt lawyer who's going to go to prison,
mm-hmm.
and the other one in First Position being about sort of an inspirational, life-affirming story of this journey of these families and their kids who want to pursue ballet for a lifestyle, as a life,
Right.
So, those stories, you really tapped into those stories. And I have to tell you, Kaya, like, in Unraveled, it sounds a little crazy, but I really tried to channel myself into the world of this lawyer, like just get into his mind. Like, why would this guy with a degree from Harvard and Yale, with this mega practice, why would he go down this path of, deception, scams, stealing, and ultimately ruining his entire name and his family's name and going to prison? Like, I really wanted to say, psychologically, what would, the human condition, what would make me do something like that?
Which, I think composers need to be good at that.
Yeah.
I feel like composers, why talk to psychiatrists? Just talk to a composer, because they have...
Kaya, you were so right. I mean, that there is such a close, and it's funny you say that, because I always feel like the relationships I make with directors and producers and anyone else creatively involved in a project, I mean, there's so much, like, I always feel like if I took psychology classes, I would have, it's very useful in the communication, in the creative communication.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but in the documentaries, you're really connecting to the stories, and with that, though, you have to have a delicate hand in documentaries. Even more so than even the smallest of indie film, because I'm always watching myself that I am doing something that is honest and true, and not at all encumbering the narrative or slanting something in a direction that the director does not want it to go to.
Right, and talking about documentaries, I've interviewed other composers who've done them, and I feel like that's a very tricky thing to do, because how do you find the right balance when you're doing a nonfiction, and how do you work around obstacles such as there's interviews, and for instance in First Position you probably had to deal with a lot of source music because it's focusing around dancers. So how do you work around stuff like that kind of pops up?
Absolutely, really, really great question, and that is the core. And I'll give you a couple answers on how I approach First Position specifically, because that one had major challenges as far as that. So just globally with documentaries, like I said, I mean, a lot of it comes with having the confidence as a composer to write small and know that you can write small and it could be as profound and as beautiful as something over the top. If you throw a blanket and write in a way, I mean, for two reasons. One, I think you're doing a disservice to the genre of documentary films, which is, almost anyone that has any sense of integrity will say they're trying to put something out there and they want the audience to decide the key element. They're not telling the audience how to decide. Now, listen, there are documentary filmmakers who make like political oriented or you have agenda driven. That's different. I'm talking about in like a documentary standard one like these two that I've done in that sense. So with the challenges like in First Position, when I first saw the film, Bess Cargman, the director, showed it to me, and it had, like you said, it has I think about 50 or 58 source cues. Now the source cues are these classic ballet, dance pieces, Tchaikovsky and all the stuff that they dance to. Okay, so not only is that stuff on screen when we're seeing them perform or rehearse or the competition in some cases, it's leaking all over the film in other areas because, look, they see someone come off stage, they're getting the reaction of the performance, and you're hearing the next performance, you're hearing the stage. I mean, that makes it really vibrant because you really feel like you're in that, you feel like you're backstage with them. But some of the most key areas that we wanted to address through the score were the reactions to performance, whether they're positive or negative, the insecurities, the finding the embracing your mother or your coach backstage, all that stuff, because what you don't get to see when you see a standard performance, right? And that's letting us into the world of what is going on through these characters. So when we looked at it and we spotted in the film, we're like, man, there's a lot of music cues that are coming right before, budding up right before, and right after. So first thing I did, like I said, I have to find a tactical way to be aware of that, and also a way to kind of make my transition as smooth as possible. So I spent hours making a key map of every source cue, what key they were in, and many of them modulate. So I have to make what key did they start, what key did they end, with the SMPTE time code. So when I wrote the cue that I knew was going to go up against those, I wrote in related keys. So if I have a cue that's ramping up to somebody that you're going to then see on stage, however I decide to resolve it, that key seamlessly goes right into the classical piece.
Oh, okay.
So just by virtue that the keys weren't like big, conflicting, weird intervals, it made the whole thing flow, and that was a big part of conquering that. And luckily, I think it works because so many people have come up to me and said it fit in so well. I didn't even know what was score and what was. I'm like, oh, well, beautiful. If anybody comes out of the experience with that, then I was happy to know that because I don't want people to be taken out of the moment. I want to enhance those moments. I don't want them to think, what is this music that came in? Is this from the stage? You don't want them to think any of that. You want them to go with it. So, and then the standard challenges on documentaries and in general are massively dialogue driven, regardless of the genre. Occasionally you get some montage moments. So as a composer, you have to always be aware dialogue is going to be key. I mean, you got to hear what these people are saying. So that does affect the writing. That affects the arrangement of the cues. And it affects, even something as simple as like, knowing, it sounds crazy, but the frequency of voices. Like, sometimes you don't write in those frequencies, knowing that, like, if you want the music to kind of envelop it but not be pulled down so much, you kind of make sure you write away from the dialogue so that the music can still serve a beautiful purpose, but not fight. I mean, that's, listen, that craft, as far as I'm concerned, of writing around dialogue for a composer is a constantly evolving craft. And that's one of those things, like when you first start in the business, it takes a while to really get that down.
When you're writing for documentaries, do you ever have to remind yourself that you're writing, for nonfiction? Do you ever get lost in like, do you feel like you're, doing a fictional story? Do you have to remind yourself that it's reality?
Yeah. I mean, it's not so much a reminder. It's just like, just checking myself and the scale. And, listen, this is also where, you rely on a director, too, for this. Like, there might be, this doesn't mean there aren't moments in a doc that you enhance a little more. Look, it's still, we're still scoring emotion and stuff. But, yes, there are times, I get wrapped up in it, and I might get wrapped up in the story. But, I think that's where the perspective comes. Like, it's something as simple as, like if you're working on a couple cues a day, maybe there's a cue I work at the end of the day, and maybe it's like, I kind of like where it's going. Mm-hmm. Instead of playing it for the director that day or when you're finished, come in the next morning, and it just does a world of good to get that one night and come in the next day. And so many times the next day I go, okay, I was close, this went a little too much, and I might scale it back, and mm-hmm. and then of course whatever feedback you get from the director as well. But yes, I am constantly keeping my antennas up to like being honest. And and not overplaying.
Right. You don't want to overdo it, or else then it becomes forced emotion, and then it kind of bogs the listener down or the viewer.
Yeah.
And so you've also done a lot of stuff for Disney and sequels for Inspector Gadget and Beverly Hills Chihuahua and Tooth Fairy. Working, they're harmless family films, but you're approaching these franchises, coming in to the second films or that have already been established. What's the challenge when you're coming into something that already has an established sound? Are the producers saying we want it to sound like this, or do you listen to the first film at all, or do you just start from scratch?
Yeah, I do, and I'll tell you the challenges on these. I got into this world because one of my dear friends, Alex Zam, is a director, and he's gotten into doing a lot of these Disney family films and the second ones. We'd always laugh. One day we're going to do the first one, But what is challenging about these? First off, doing a family, any kind of comedy or comedy family or a comedy that skews young, is one of the hardest things to do. I mean, for a composer, for two reasons. The sheer scope of music you're writing is insane. I mean, these movies are temped and they're spotted almost wall-to-wall music. I mean, I go into these spotting segments. I always laugh because I always say, why don't you just start at 1 hour and then I'll just end at 1 hour and 48 minutes, I mean, there are barely any gaps. I mean, I think that's a little problematic too in the fact that I think everyone is overusing music and film in general, but I understand for a kid's audience. Okay, so the challenges that are, first off, it's an enormous amount of music written. Most of the directors, especially Alex, my friend in this case, he is one of these guys that is very meticulous. He likes perspective shifts, everything scored, everything hit. It's not like I'm playing overcuts and stuff. It's really like, now the angle of the dog, and now from this, and so like all those things he likes addressed. He likes that style of scoring. It's kind of a classic comedy style, although I might be modernizing it. So but with that comes a lot of work. I mean, that's like, you're not just plowing through writing big melodies. Like, everything is hit in the dress, making hit points. So that's challenging. I do listen to the scores of all the first because usually the studio is going to want to just make sure that, like, it doesn't. They're not asking me to cop the themes or do or not, but they want it to have some relevance, as I'm sure they do in the script writers as well. They try to keep it on point.
Right.
So and then the third thing that's the biggest challenge is the budgets for the sequels are probably a quarter of what they spent on the real one. Right. So now I'm listening to Beverly Hills Chihuahua, the first score. It's like a 90-piece orchestra. It sounds incredible, with all those nylon string guitars and all that stuff. So I'm like, okay, great. And now, I don't have anywhere near the budget for that.
Right.
So, it takes a lot of kind of inventiveness to do my best because I want to keep the scale on that level. And look, the director did the same thing too. He had less money and he's still trying to make sure all the effects and the CGI, they don't look compromised because the budget is lower. So I honestly feel like it's harder to do the sequels of a lot of these films for that reason.
I mean, and also, you're dealing with I think a lot of people put a label on them. They're like, oh, they're just direct to video and stuff. But I know you guys are trying. No one, I don't think, sets out to make bad movies and stuff like that.
No, it's a great point. And look, you could look at things that way. Look, to me, it's an opportunity. And look, I'm not saying I only want to do those films in my whole life, but you have a film in front of you. You do the best possible job. You learn a lot from the process. You hopefully make some new connections of people that become fans of yours. And that's really all you can do. Yeah, exactly. Look, are the scripts always the best in the world? No, not necessarily. But I have news for you. Those films, almost every one of those sequels, if you ask the studio as far as their investment and their payoff, thrilled. They do tremendous.
Yeah. Definitely.
It's crazy. I mean, it's like they would do that every time if they could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, to slowly wrap things up, I'll ask you some hypothetical questions. So
this is gonna get hard now.
So I kind of thought of this when I was asking you about setting and character and stuff. I don't think I haven't asked anybody this question, but say I gave you a candid picture of a person, just snapshot of their daily life, or I gave you a picture of a house in a meadow or a cottage or something. What photograph would you want to write, say, a 4-minute suite to? What would be easier for you?
Okay, so let me get my choice here. What curtain? The curtain one is a photograph of the house on a meadow.
Yeah.
The other one, the first one was
just a person, maybe sitting on a bench, maybe eating food. What would be easier to write? A suite.
I'm going to say the easier to write is the meadow, the house in the meadow. First off, it's not a human character, right? Although, I would interpret that as, I could clearly score that in a John Williams way and make it a glorious Americana thing. I could score it like in a horror genre and make it like God knows what lurks inside of this house, right? So, yeah. I mean, I could look at that. I will quote Billy Wilder, the great filmmaker who I read his book, and I think it's essential for every composer to read this book. And what he says in the book is he says, if you have a scene where a guy, opens his door and enters his house, fine. He says, have him enter through the window, and now you got something. And I think it's brilliant because what he's talking about is the subtext. Because first you're going to say, well, why is this guy going through a window? Is he robbing the house? Did he forget his keys? Is he sneaking in? Right? It says so much more than just opening up a door.
Right.
So that's why I would make that parallel. But what I say about the person is, there are probably more creative liberties I could take. I could probably slant that in many different ways. Because I would just say, I can dig into well, who is this person? Is he quirky? Is he odd? Is he lonely? So I think the easier choice would be the meadow because it's not the human element.
Okay, cool. Very good answer. I like it. And I always wrap up with this question. I always ask composers, if you had the chance to write the score to any film ever made, with no disrespect to the original composer, what film would you choose?
Man, okay, just give me a second or two, because I kind of have a list. Okay, you're not saying from the point of view of I didn't like what they did. You're saying from the point of view of an opportunity.
Right. No disrespect. What playground would you like to play in? What story inspires you, wants you to make you write the music?
I'll tell you films that I come back to that I'm very connected to. I'll look at a film like The Insider, right? Something like that deals with, you've got massive emotion, you've got a lot of internal, kind of just interesting characters, shot in the way of Michael Mann shoots, so it's fascinating. I'll pick that film and say even other things in that genre I would just love to delve into, because you can really see it's interesting, because I think, and I'm catching myself by saying that, I think when you look at a film like that, it's sort of combining the skills I have in a way, because you come from the doc world, right? And Michael Mann kind of makes those films, specific in The Insider, they're not these big scores, they're tapping into something at a core level, and that's what I find really challenging and satisfying. I did a film, The Take, that had John Leguizamo in there, and I got to explore that world a little. It's a really great little film, and I just so fell in love with that process, and I don't necessarily, I haven't done too many more in that genre recently, but I hope I get a chance to explore that field even more, And Kai, I'd love to just mention one thing offhand. Someone asked me once, and your questions reminded me of this. Mm-hmm. They always say well, what's the easiest genre of of film music to write? And I always answer the same way. I go, big bombast. Right. Always the easiest.
Yeah.
Because any composer with decent skills and knows how to how the orchestra works and functions, big melodies, sweeping, and this is no disrespect for the guys that do that masterfully. But, you're dealing with a specific sound that's big and broad. You're not dealing with intricacies in a similar level. And it's and everyone accepts that it's big and over the top. So, right off the bat, it's okay, great, go for it. Right. It's pedal to the metal and have fun and write a beautiful theme, So.
It's true. Hans Zimmer was talking about Inception, and there's a track called Mombasa, and it's just just a crazy action track. And he's like, I wrote that in one night. The other stuff was the hard stuff,
It's interesting to hear that, because that really is true. And, I think that extends into, DPs, too. Directors of photography, they get credit. I'll never forget the guy that won an Out of Africa. I think he was an English gentleman. And when he got his Oscar, he said, I won this Oscar because of my second unit team. Thank you to them. Because he knew that Oscar voters were voting him that Oscar on those big shots of the animals on the planes, right?
Right.
When he said in an interview, they don't realize that the hardest thing to do is like light a scene in a tent, capture a scene in a tent with the candle on beautifully, So same kind of thing. So really interesting parallel, man.
Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic interview. Thank you so much for the time. It really
Kaya, thank you. I hope I didn't wax too poetic, but I really enjoyed speaking with you, and thanks for the time as well.